I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the chair of the master's program in curatorial practice at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And each week I host a distinguished curator or director for the curatorial roundtable. Our program is a 2-year master's program in every aspect of professional curating. And the curatorial roundtable is really about listening to curators and directors from all over the world speak about their practice, exhibitions or projects they've done, just as a way of really understanding the vast range of curatorial practices in the world. And so today, I'm happy to have Anthony Huberman with us, and I'm going to read a short bio that he's given us. So Anthony is a curator and writer based in New York now. He's currently the artistic director of Giorno Poetry Systems, a nonprofit organization that supports artists, poets, and musicians. Previously, he was director and chief curator of the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts in San Francisco, founding director of the Artists Institute in New York, curator at Palais de Tokyo in Paris, curator of Sculpture Center in New York, and director of public programs at MoMA PS1 in New York. He's curated exhibitions also at Raven Row in London, Kunstwerke in Berlin, Poltergeist in Lisbon, and Secession in Vienna, and co-curated the 2014 Liverpool Biennial. Some of his major group exhibitions include Drum Listens to Heart, Mechanisms, For the Blind Man in the Dark Room Looking for the Black Cat That Isn't There, and Gray Flags. Recent books include Cecilia Vicuña, Word Weapons, What Happens Between the Knots, Where Are the Tiny Revolts, Abbas Tiyuki writing alongside exhibitions, and Today We Should Be Thinking About. Is that right? Have I missed a word? No, that's it. Okay. Just the way that this works, Anthony is going to speak for about 50 minutes. And at that point, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you can put a question or comment in the Q&A section. Anthony will respond. We'll try to finish up in just about an hour. It's quite relaxed. So Anthony, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for inviting me, and thank you to all of those who attended. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on some of what I'll share, and also to working with the students in a more focused way later on. But I have prepared a little simple kind of narration or walkthrough of this idea that I proposed, that I shared of the notion of the artist-centric and what that might mean. So let me share my screen. As you can see, I'm doing this instead of a PowerPoint. As you can see, there's all these many tabs up here at the top of the screen. And I'm just going to work my way through. That's kind of this alternative to PowerPoint, because that way I can use in the more animated web pages rather than a static image. So as I said here, presented what it means for an organization to be artist-centered. Now, obviously, that's not a question that's all that possible to answer in general, and certainly not in an hour, because it means, it means so many different things, or it can mean so many different things. Actually, for example, I was able to watch you guys. The SVA itself hosted a lecture just not that long ago with my colleague Kate Fowl, who talked exactly about this topic. And so if those of you who haven't watched this lecture, it's online, and she has lots of things to say about, from her perspective, what it might mean to be artist-centered. And so, there's a lot of ways that one can take this topic, there's a long history of artist-run spaces. There's artist cooperative of all types and shapes and sizes. There's artist foundations. There's museum directors like Kate or Matthew Higgs, or many others who are artists, but also then become curators and museum directors. And there's all kinds of ways to approach what does it mean for an organization to have artists in the driving seat, for that perspective to be the one leading the way. And so I'm not going to give a historical overview of all those different possibilities, but I am going to just talk about this in a very personal way and tell you some stories, maybe is the best way to put it, or tell you about some lessons that I feel I've learned from particular artists. So if this is a topic, rather than talking about institutional frameworks that put artists at the center, I thought it made more sense to just tell you about some artists that have done things either with me or with nothing to do with me that have been really informative in the way that that have shaped the way that I work as a curator. So first one, Paul Pfeiffer. Paul is an artist who lives here in New York, actually has a show up right now, those of you in the Los Angeles region, a retrospective show at MoCA. I met Paul around 2000 or so when he was part of the first Greater New York and at PS1 when I was working there. So it's been some years. But the reason I brought him up is that when I was at Sculpture Center, I started a little lecture series called The Subjective Histories of Sculpture. And the idea was, if Sculpture Center is supposed to be about sculpture, then what is sculpture and how can artists kind of help us to potentially complicate what we mean by sculpture? And so the idea of the lecture series was very simple. It was like, what could you narrate? We went to various artists and we just said, could you present a lecture where you narrate from your perspective what for you are the building blocks that make up your own definition of what sculpture is? And so Paul was the first one to do this. And so his lecture began with a particular scene from The Exorcist movie. And then it went on to a particular scene in the novel Heart of Darkness. And then it went on to those little insects that can kind of camouflage themselves, when they go on, they attach themselves to a part of a branch and they become the color of that branch. And then he talked about Dan Graham's glass pavilions, on and on. So I'm not going to narrate his whole lecture, but it really, for me, was really inspiring in the sense of here is someone who, when turned over to him, when he is asked to kind of give what make up the pillars that have helped him understand what sculpture is, it really goes very much outside of the bounds of what a traditional definition might be. And it just helped me appreciate the ways in which, artists are not necessarily people who are involved in, kind of providing an academic explanation of an idea, but are really much more interested in trying to, in other words, I left this lecture in a way understanding a little bit less about sculpture than when I began, right? I walked in with a clear sense of what I thought sculpture was, and I left with a completely exploded sense. The second person who did this lecture is Trisha Donnelly, who did the second one. She is also an artist who I've since then had a long-standing relationship with and I've worked with on many occasions. Her whole lecture was basically about radio plays, her history of sculpture, and it was about the way that sound moves through walls and how the materiality of sound has this property that can kind of penetrate solid material. Anyway, so the whole lecture was structured around what radio plays are and how they work. And then John Armleder was the third person to do the lecture in this series. And for him, the history of sculpture, he said, just scan the pages of this one book, which was a book by a botanist called Ernst Haeckel, who wrote a book called Art Forms in Nature. And it just was a series of illustrations of various kind of botanical drawings. John narrated the ways in which this book and Haeckel's approach to it for him made up of what sculpture was. So again, for me, this was these artists. The series went on after this. I left Sculpture Center, and they did many more of these, and so I didn't really see other ones. But for me, this was really an early. This is probably 2000. It's funny how this poster doesn't have a date on it, but I think it's around 2006. And for me, it was an important early example of that artists, if maybe that artists aren't in the explanation business, and they're much more connected to trying to kind of add a glitch into the flow of the known, to try to kind of add and tie some knots into the way in which we think we know what we think we already know, and to kind of complicate that a little bit. And so therefore, for me, maybe exhibitions can also perform that task. And maybe explanations don't necessarily need to be thought of as explanation machines, but that exhibitions can somehow be thought of in this similar way of trying to understand, trying to take an idea and kind of not undo it, but for the purpose of the exhibition is for an audience member to come and be left, kind of being more curious about the topic of the exhibition, rather than, being given a lecture and told exactly what everything means. So for me, this was an early important reference, and so maybe one way of being artist-centered is to ask artists to play this role a bit, and to empower them to redefine the words that we use, redefine the categories that we use, and see what happens. This move went on later that year to an exhibition that then I invited Paul to co-curate with me. So this was an early example of an artist curated exhibition, although it was a collaboration between him and I. Here's a couple of different examples. This exhibition was basically, this is Gabriela Roscoe, Lutz Bacher, and Helen Chadwick. Here's Tacita Dean. There's a Michael Kreber slide projection. This is Claire Fontaine, neon piece. John Armletter. Oh, some of these images don't work. Apapi Chung, we're Asetical, Mario Ibarra. The exhibition was basically about the identity crisis, not crisis, but where sculpture. We were talking a lot about, and Paul again helped me think this through about what sculpture is put under the category of sculpture, especially in art school context. If you're a painter, you're in the painting department. If you're a photographer, you're in the photography department. If you're an installation artist, sound artist, new media artist, sculptor, all of these kind of other performance artists, you kind of end up being put in the sculpture department. And so there's this thing about, if sculpture as a category is kind of meant as to contain all of that and mean so much, then how could it mean much? How could it be useful as a identifier? What does it actually describe about what an artist is doing if it somehow at this stage has grown to refer to so many different practices? So the exhibition was trying to deal with artists who also are interested in kind of multiplying the ways in which they work so that they become hard to identify. But in general, for me, it was a really important lesson about what it means to work with artists on a curatorial level. The press release was also a space that, again, I would argue in the context of this lecture, was artist-centered, in the sense that the press release itself was something that was hard to identify. We approached an artist named Seth Price, who was asked for him to occupy would be, can your contribution revolve around how the information about this show is distributed, and that be the area in which you can contribute, because this exhibition, again, if this exhibition is really trying to think about ways in which artists complicate how information and how identification works with regards to what it is that they do, Seth essentially had a text that he had already written, that he had already contributed as a press release to a previous exhibition that had been called Gray Flags in a completely different context. And so his piece in the show was the material was exhibition title, exhibition press release, which made it very hard to Google, because when you Googled Gray Flags or anything about this press release, a completely other show that was called this with the same exact text appeared in your results that had nothing to do with me, nothing to do with Paul Pfeiffer, nothing to do with Sculpture Center. So it was an interesting kind of problem created with regards to how can this exhibition distinguish itself from other exhibitions if the main tools that exhibitions have to identify themselves are their titles and the language that the curator uses to describe what they're about. Both of those zones have been taken over and made indistinguishable from others in this case. So again, another way maybe to be artist-centered is really simply to let artists do these kinds of things, allow these difficulties to emerge, and allow institutions sometimes shy away from these kinds of interventions. And it's really important, I think, to let these things take place. And again, for me, was really an important lesson of how an artist can determine how an institution functions. There was a book. I won't talk too much about the book, but it was a kind of green paper phone book, not a document of the show. This is something for another lecture, but I have a long-standing practice in exhibition catalogs not being necessarily documents of the exhibition, but kind of existing alongside the exhibition, adjacent to the exhibition, perhaps in the same way as the subjective histories of sculpture was not necessarily quote unquote about sculpture, but is a kind of adjacent story that when placed alongside one's existing understanding of sculpture, something between the insect on the tree and one's understanding of sculpture, an audience's attempt to try to reconcile those two things, that's where meaning happens. And so in the same way, for me, I've always started thinking since Gray Flags and moving on to many other books, that a book is one thing and an exhibition is something next to it, and an audience can kind of reconcile how the two overlap. And so my essay, for example, was a series of photocopies of a Fischli and Weiss book, was my kind of catalog essay in the context of this. Again, a pretty artist-centered catalog essay. Another artist that I've learned a lot from, I mean, my current job, it's funny, have looped back around to working with Ugo a lot more than when I first met him back in Paris, when I helped him organize an exhibition where he was given a kind of carte blanche at the Palais de Tokyo to do an exhibition called The Third Mind. And for me, this was a pretty extraordinary exhibition, an example of a couple things. One, again, building on this notion of what happens when artists take on the role of exhibition curator. What forms does that take? How does it come out? Is it a distinguishable phenomenon? Does it look different? Does it feel different? What happens that doesn't otherwise maybe happen in museum context? And so these were these incredible juxtapositions that he would make. Maybe I should narrate what's going on here. This is a Sarah Lucas entrance piece. Huge Ronald Bladen sculptures, and then Katie Noland works along the side is what we're seeing here. With Nancy Grossman masks along one edge. Here is a room with these Paul Tech pieces and these drawings by the Swiss healer Emma Kuntz. He was kind of an amazing room of Laurie Parsons, kind of detritus sculpture with a Robert Gober sink. Here was a huge Austrian sculptor named Bruno Gironcoli, presented with these tiny little paintings by Sue Williams. Anyway, I think you get, this is another Hans Josefsson with Lee Bonteque. Andrew Lord, ceramics with an artist named Jean-Frédéric Schneider, who made these little paintings of Swiss train station waiting rooms. And it was really about the ways in which, this is Joe Brainerd, the ways in Joe Brainerd and Jay DeFeo. This is a beautiful room of Bruce Conner and Andy Warhol screen test, these kind of dead people in this dark room. It really, not only, for me, it taught me a lot about what happens, you know, when the kind of artist as curator opens up all kinds of doors and surprises, and the third mind relates to this very simple idea developed by William Burroughs and Brian Gysin that, you know, 1 + 1 = 3, right? That creating these juxtapositions always exceeds what they mean, right? There's always that excessive component that when you create these juxtapositions of physical things in a room, you know, this is what curating is. It's not necessarily to prove how similar they are, or look how this is also related to that. It's more, in this sense, a more poetic exercise of, like, when those combination is made, something else is able to emerge, something that is not in the room. And that, for me, that lesson has remained with me very closely. Every time I install a show, that's essentially what I have in mind, is trying to create something where what emerges from the room is the thing that's not actually there, but is made possible by by how you handle the different juxtapositions. I ended up doing a bunch of writing years later about the history of this, I think, very understudied topic of the artist as curator. There's a lot of examples, but there's really not that much kind of academic scholarship. I was invited by Elena Filipovic, who edited a book about the topic, to write about one of them, and I wrote about the show that in 1969, one of the really early example of Andy Warhol doing an exhibition at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum. And you can read it here on I mean, this is just a kind of a short excerpt, I think. It's not the whole thing. But you should get the book. And again, just to point that there's a history here, and I think that it's useful for curators to learn about about what happens and what forms the exhibition takes when artists play the role of curator. In this case, at RISD, Warhol essentially went to the storage room in the basement and just said, please move all of this, not all of it, but move a bunch of things upstairs. And the curators were like, oh, but which of these boxes would you like to put on display in the galleries? And he looked at them confusingly and was like, all of them, installed on the shelves, that the kind of falling apart shelves that they were on in the storage, just all of the shelving unit just to be brought upstairs. Lutz Bacher is another really important artist to my career and my life, and maybe more importantly. You saw earlier when she had a series of photographs in Gray Flag, so that's when I first met her. But the reason I bring Lutz up, I mean, not only is she an artist whose work I have been interested in and thought about and written about and done a lot of things with over the years, but I wanted to bring her up because it really is about the importance of how working with artists is a relationship. And those relationships evolve over time. And to try to make sure that relationship has a tendency, unfortunately, of being kind of sometimes transactional in nature. I have a museum, you're an artist, I need you to do your thing in my galleries. Please come and do it. Okay, thanks for doing it. Bye, see you later. Next artist. Okay, I have a museum, I have an empty room. Please come do your thing in my empty room. Okay, thanks. Okay, bye. Like, that's a transactional relationship, I guess. And so I think, again, what does it mean to be artist-centered is to, no artists want to be on the end of or I guess some do, but end of a transaction. But and so for me, Lutz has been someone who not only have I had a longstanding relationship with, but that inevitably I ended up working with her many different times. So the first time, as you saw in Great Flags, the second time was a big solo show here in 2008. When I was working at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, as the chief curator there, and during that period, here's a few different images of that show. Yeah, it was a little. Yeah, I'm not going to go into Lutz's work. These huge text pieces are, taken from these little slips of paper that hotels in China would give you in order to be able to hand them to a taxi driver. In case you don't speak Chinese, this is outside of the building. Anyway, and then when I changed jobs, I left St. Louis and I started this place called the Artists Institute. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But the very first thing we showed was a painting by Lutz. So once again, she played a role into a different context. Another exhibition in 2012 at the Contemporary Art Center in Geneva, called Coming Soon, which I included this simple video piece in an exhibition there. And then at the Wadis in 2017, this is a group show called Mechanism, and she also contributed a huge wall piece involved, which are these mirrored domes that get placed in front of security cameras. And then that show also went to the Secession, and here is another piece by Lutz, this kind of badly painted wall with these chalkboards. And then just last fall, I did a big solo show. She passed away a couple years before this. And so this was a little bit of a kind of dedication to her. A thank you for so many years of conversation. And so this is in London at Raven Row, which filled this old townhouse with that same work again. A big installation here called Empire, Yamaha organ. This show revolved around Lutz's relationship to song and music and sound. I bring it up so without sound, it's a little bit hard to understand this show, but it just gives you a little flavor. I bring it up really again to say that, to encourage anyone out there that that working with the same people again and again in different ways and different contexts, because Mark's, the relationship and the conversation I had with her evolved over time and changed, and therefore there was always something else to say and something else to do. And I again, for me, one way of being artist-centered was to kind of have this act of going back to reoccurring relationships with the same people. Jimmy Durham, I bring up here for a couple reasons. Is an artist who passed away recently, and for me has been also an important interlocutor and someone that I feel like I've learned a lot from. And I bring it up because he was also ended up being the subject of a little organization I started in 2010 called the Artists Institute, which has this great kind of grandiose name, but actually is a basement on the Lower East Side. And in what way is this artist-centered? For me, I arrived at a point where I asked myself, I'm learning all this from artists. What would it mean if an entire organization is dedicated to one artist for a period of time? And so at the Artists Institute, this was the website. We divide the year into 2 seasons and dedicated each one to a single artist. So essentially, this little storefront, this little home away from home, or whatever this feels like and looks like, is essentially for a period of 6 months, everything that happens in here all revolves around the work of one person. So if you're someone who's interested in that one person, this is your home. This is your community can gather here. And becomes this kind of organization really dedicated to one person for a longer period of time. Here are the ones that I stayed there for these 6 seasons, Jimmy Durham. This is an old archived website. Now it's gone on to be. So this narrates what happens during a season. There is one artwork. Oh yeah, I should say the space is so small that it's okay. We were able to put one artwork at a time on the wall. So as you walked in over the course of 6 months, we changed it maybe 3 or 4 times, but it was just a single piece, always by Jimmy Durham. And then that became a changing context. Again, using that one artist at the center as a kind of core foundation, and then allowing that to open up in all kinds of different directions, whether it's art curators that have worked with him, whether it's other organizations that are more related to Jimmy in a more thematic way, whether, it goes from poetry to music to lectures to another artwork hanging in the gallery during a period of time. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of, same thing for Rosemary Trockle, one artwork at a time, and then all these different kind of activations happen around this one artwork. So for me, this was obviously a very artist-centered way of thinking, where the entire organization is essentially revolving around a single figure for an extended period of time. It's a little bit on hiatus right now. I'm not sure what the future. I hope it lasted for many, many more years after this. Let me go to let's see if I can just quickly go to the so you can get a sense of yeah. There you go. A lot of different people. And there's the beginning. Yeah. But I hired a very smart curator named Jenny Jaski, who then took it over and did an extraordinary job and many years after that. And she's moved on. And so now it's a little bit in a dormant state, but I hope they find a next plan. It was, however, as you can see, it was a small place. It was very fragile and precarious also on a financial level. It all was just an idea that I gave birth to and didn't really have solid footing. And so I was approached then by the Artists Institute was connected to Hunter College. And so then I was approached by the California College of the Arts, another school, and this time in San Francisco, who have also their institute called the Wattis Institute that has been part of CCA for some time and has a lot more infrastructure, has a lot more kind of shelf life and stability. And we're really interested in what I was trying to do with the Artists Institute. And so essentially asked the degree to which I would want to propose building on that and doing it and extending its life and doing it in a new way in a new context. And so I did. We did the mission. I guess the one thing I wanted to point here was again, going back to this central idea of what does it mean to be artist-centered? I mean, to put this question, which basically as the mission statement, which essentially it was for the Wattis, how can this question drive our work? How can asking that question over a period of time is going to inevitably lead to different answers depending on the year, depending on what's going on in the world, depending on what artists are making, depending on who the curators are that are choosing which artists we're learning from. All those are constantly in motion and constantly changing, guaranteeing that the answer to that question will always be a work in progress. but that kind of an institution can revolve around it. And so that's another way I feel of kind of putting artists at the center, is just kind of providing, you know, having the mission really be in the form of a question so that it can stay open and not predetermined, not a kind of recipe, but that yeah. So the two ways in which there was two kind of predetermined formats that the institution that I developed for the WADIS to be able to answer this question. One was an exhibition program, and one was a research program. So how do what can we learn from artists today? Well, on one hand, we can learn from them by commissioning new work and by seeing the work that they are making in the current moment. How are artists responding to our world as we live it right now? By commissioning a new body of work, you get to learn a bit about how are artists responding to the present. That's kind of what was the backbone of the exhibition program. And then the research program was asking that question to a community, kind of an intellectual community, and doing what I was doing at the Artists Institute, but this time for an entire year, not 6 months. So we dedicated an entire year to a single artist, again, not as a subject to an exhibition, because that was happening in the gallery, but in a separate space, in a bar that we built for this. That space became a place where one artist became the anchor, the center, for a whole year's worth of events and reading groups and publications and events. So just to give you a sense of this over the years, you know, you go back to, so here these two parallel programs, and so we have the exhibition program here, and then we have the research program there. So these are different artists, and then, you know, one at a time we would do. So these research programs, you know, Andrea Fraser, again, really similar. You can recognize a lot from the Artists Institute. It was all very deliberate. You know, even the graphic design of this website, I wanted to be very transparent about the fact that we were essentially building on something that we had started kind of prototype style at the Artists Institute, but doing it with a lot more infrastructure here in San Francisco. So even on a graphic level, the kind of this graphic design was obviously almost the same as this one. And so we have a little introduction to Andrea Fraser. There would be an essay written about the artist by the curator who's in charge of this season. And then we would do a lot of events in the same way that we did it in New York. And we did, you know, what are some, just to give you a sense of Seth Price, Dodie Bellamy. She's a great writer. And we framed it on our mind, meaning there would be an artist that is on view, meaning their work is on view, their physical things are on display in a gallery. And the other ones are not on view, right? They're on our mind. There's not a physical show that you can walk into and see. You know, this is really more of a topic, more of a framework to gather a community together to think about, write about, and talk about a particular artist practice over a period of a year. Cecilia Vicuña, Lorraine O'Grady, and then we took a year off. In the current year, yeah, again, this is past my time, but this is what currently is for all of you in San Francisco. Looks like there's, where are we? Look at that. Here we go. It looks like there's some events coming up here. Okay, moving on. So Sam is a young artist. It's funny how all the other artists I talked about are that kind of older generation. Sam is a young artist, and the reason I bring him up is to say two things. I mean, one, sorry, this little thing is in my way. Here we go. One thing is because there was an exhibition that I did solo of commissioning new work in 2015, and here at the WADIS, here's show. Won't go into too much detail, but essentially he kind of diverted the electricity of the lighting track, and that rather than lighting the lights of the room, we're turning, these are heating, kind of bare bones heating blankets. So it was this kind of rerouting of electricity that an institution needs to light and make visible what it's showing was rerouted to become heat. And anyway, I bring Sam up because I have done group exhibitions from time to time. And of course, those inevitably are more curatorial in nature. You know, it's not an artist solo show. It's not a commissioning of a new work. And so therefore, you know, how do we think about even a group show in a kind of artist-centered way? And this is something that I never did on purpose, but it's more retrospective, is that I've learned over the years that by working with one artist at a time over a longer period of time, really building a long relationship with them and just exchanging, you know, a long-standing dialogue and conversation inevitably is an inspiring process that plants ideas. And almost all of my group shows have those ideas for an idea to do a group show about have all begun in this way. So I credit really Sam, my relationship with Sam, among others, as one of the main sources for what then became a very big group show that involved, actually Sam wasn't even in the exhibition in the end because he had already done a solo exhibition, but it's just to point out the way in which even these large group show exhibitions that deal in this case with the notion of technology and the ways in which artists are trying to go against the kind of mantra of efficiency, or efficiency is somehow good or better. And this exhibition was kind of arguing not that inefficiency is better, but that at least that art in general, but that these particular artists are invested in some way in trying to slow the immediacy of that down, of that, you know, kind of the logic that the technology field uses to justify why what it's doing is valuable, is all based on, well, because it's more efficient to do it this way. But then my question is, why is efficiency the value that we're building a world around? And so that's what this, so here we had, just to show you, and yeah, maybe it's too long to narrate this, but just to give you a visual sense of what this looks like. But I just bring it up because this is all, and Aaron Flint Jameson is the other artist that conversations and longstanding relationships with him is what also led to this show taking form. And so even group shows that are not even co-curated with an artist, but just myself as a thinker and writer and person in the world, you know, all these ideas for doing this come from somewhere. And from my case, again, not on purpose, but inevitably by doing these long commission-based practice, you end up learning a lot from those. And then they lead to, years down the road, they lead to these big group shows where here, what are 15 other artists that are circling around some of these related ideas? But it always somehow, for me, I found, looking back retrospectively, have an origin point in conversations I have with artists. This is the same show that went in a new form to Secession in Vienna called Other Mechanisms. And Sam was included in that show this time around because he had not shown at Secession before. And a bunch of changes were made to this version. Jan Vo, Louise Lawler. Anyway, I know we're coming up to 9:45 here. David Hammons is another artist. So David Hammons is someone whose work has been an inspiration to many, but to me, I count myself as to one of those people who have spent enormously influenced in many ways by what Hammons has made, and again, we did a year-long season around Hammons, which for me was, we did an incredible series of events, and with a lot of very special guests that played a role, and we brought to San Francisco that talked, that screened, that played music, that wrote essays, a lot of really interesting kind of exploded ecosystem around Hammond. And I wrote an essay here that began the season. And at the end of the essay, I just spent a lot of time thinking about this. And at the end of the essay, I found this kind of quote here by Jack Whitten, which you can read on the screen. When my white slave masters discovers that my drum was a subversive instrument, they took it from me. The only instrument available was my body, so I used my skin, clapped my hands, slapped my thighs, and stomped my feet in dynamic rhythms. And this notion of, this is obviously, yeah, this found his drum phrase is obviously a kind of metaphor, but it really planted a seed for me of the drum or the kind of act of percussion as having something to do with a lot more than just making music. Obviously having to do with forms of emancipation, with forms of with threatening forms of authority. All kinds of histories that relate to percussion. And so that led years later to a 3-part exhibition called Drum Listens to Heart, which took place, as you can see, in these 3, rather than having a huge building where you can go from gallery to gallery, I basically used our smaller building and then changed it 3 times. And so you end up with as I do the slideshow, it looks like the rooms go on and on, but actually it's the same 4 rooms 3 times. Milford Graves, this is an interesting Inuit artist on the walls there. This is a African artist, Mkal Ayongakpa, Lee Lozano, Barry LeVay, Davina Semo, Michael E. Smith, Lucy Raven, The Astrid Gate, Autolith Group, Francis Elise, David Hammond, Nick Kay, Raven Chacon, Guadalupe Maravilla, Ria Nakajima. Anyway, it gives you a little bit of a sense. Haegyu Yang. We built a bookshop. We turned the bar into a pop-up record shop that only had drumming records in it. Anyway, that's Drum Listens to Heart. But again, that all kind of came from artists. And so I'll end with kind of where I'm at right now, which in a way takes this to yet another form of being artist-centered. In the sense that John Giorno founded an organization back in 1965 called Giorno Poetry Systems. And the mission of the organization that he founded was really his attempt of trying to find different systems of supporting his peers, supporting other artists, other poets, and other musicians. How could he use the mechanism that is a 501c3 nonprofit and mobilize the abilities of what that infrastructure could provide to be able to kind of show up in a kind of peer-to-peer way and help not help, but support and provide different types of opportunities to other artists and other musicians and other poets. And so he did so in a wide range of ways, all of which are kind of listed here and are still happening. There is a series of events. There is a record label. There is a series of phone numbers that you can call for poetry. And there's a series of grants being given to artists and musicians and poets. So, and this is an example of it. It's an entire organization that is founded by an artist with a mission of supporting the work of other artists as its core. So I think that, again, is another way in which the notion of the artist-centered can make itself manifest. Here's the building, regular series of events. Every event here, as you can see, the prompt that we give to artists and poets and musicians is not to share their own, it's New York, I think, has a lot of venues where artists can show an audience the things that they do, and poets can share with an audience the things that they write, and musicians can share with an audience what they do. But so we're not trying to compete with that. In our case, it's more about, is there something or someone that you can share with your audience, you know, a perspective you have about the work of what someone else is doing. And so that's kind of the structure of the events. And you can see in the past, this is a poet, Yuko Otomo, who introduced and hosted a beautiful evening with an amazing jazz, avant-garde jazz pianist, Matthew Shipp, and other poets that have contributed to that too. An artist, Dora Budor, curated a whole amazing screening night. This is another poet who kind of gave a talk about the work of peer poets. This is a record shop, and Adrian, a musician, who curated a concert with 2 other musicians. Anyway, and it kind of keeps going. The one coming up I recommend just on this week, there's a photographer who is kind of creating an environment involving these other artists to create to really transform the space. So that's very much, you know, artist-centered. The record label has, and again, when John Giorno was alive, he would be the one choosing everything. And so that's the transition that we're making. If John is not alive, who chooses what artists go on the record, what artist gets an event, what artist gets a grant, which artist goes onto the phone number? And our answer to that is very simple: other artists. You know, that other artists, other poets and musicians are the ones prompted to be the ones who will jury our grant program, be the ones who will be editing the kind of mixtape compilation records that we're going to be putting out, be the ones determining what are the events and whose work can the event program celebrate and feature. So this is a last way of what the being artist-centered is. I'll skip that. And I'll just end here, which is a last artist that for me is very important, and not only on a just basic way, because it's a lifelong love affair that I've had with this group, but also because something about scale. You know, there's this line that I always think about, which is that, you know, not that many people saw the Velvet Underground play a live concert. When they were doing that, it was really a small audience. But a lot of the people who did see them play went on to form their own bands. So for me, what's interesting about that is something about scale. That one way to think about scale is not necessarily how many artists are you working with, how big is your reach, but more to trust that if you do something with nurturing those relationships, with the kind of quality of the relationship with these artists, and create something that has a clear meaning and power to it, and people will come and then they will be inspired by it and do their version. And that's a much more interesting way to grow. Have other people learn from what you're doing and do their version around the world. And that's, I think, a different way, a more artist-centered way of growing than buying more land and making your building even bigger. Right? I mean, it's just 2 different ways of thinking about growth and scale, and how even something that might be small, in the case of GPS, it's a very small loft, but, you know, impact, I guess I'm arguing, and Velvet Underground argues, that scale of impact doesn't necessarily correspond with scale of, you know, the physical building. And the last thing, just to invite everyone, open invitation, that the Bowery building is a very historical one. It's a very unique and beautiful and strange, and has once housed the studios of Mark Rothko, Linda Benglis, William Burroughs lived there for a long time. And so we're making that a little bit more open. So just open invitation at any Tuesday night. It's open, and please come by. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. So we do have one question.
Okay.
I like the idea of small spaces. Thank you. Has anyone done a show using the format of a progressive dinner where folks in a neighborhood would temporarily convert their living rooms into micro exhibition spaces to be visited sequentially? I mean, I immediately think about Chambre d'Amis Jan Hut when that was in Ghent, I think, in
the 80s.
1986, something like that. And Mice and Men at KW in Berlin that Maurizio Catalan, Massimiliano Joni, and who was it? Ali Subotnik, I think,
Yeah.
did. Anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean,
Other ones?
those two examples are, I mean, I don't know about, I'm sure there's many examples of this. I mean, on one level, this is happening all the time. I mean, the amount of artists in, Ridgewood right now, as we are speaking, that last night had some kind of art event in their living room are probably, it's probably a handful. It's just something that is organically part of what artists are doing, and now, when I was younger and I would know about a lot of those things and go to them and be part of those communities, there's an extraordinary vibrancy to that scale. I mean, I always feel like the cultural health of any city in many ways can be determined by how active it is at that scale, which is why art schools are so important to any cultural community, because it just guarantees that every September a new group of people obsessed with art are going to move to your city. And
Right.
that it's so incredibly important that that energy is, there's a guarantee built into your city, in your community, that appetite is constantly coming in because there's a great art school that's drawing that energy in, and those students are going to do things in their bedrooms because that's the space they have. And that's very important to not only recognize as being a vital contribution, no matter how big or small, and to just celebrate in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is interesting also in that it kind of resonates with the Artists Institute, this idea that there's some direct relationship between an artist and a community, whether it's a community of artists or just the community in general. But of course, I'm trying to think about all the different, I mean, even from Rickard, on this idea of a meal together.
Right.
That's so important.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the thing about these apartment, this question talks about apartments, living spaces, this GPS, the loft on the Bowery, is the first time that I've dealt with this as a living space, and it's very much not a display space, right? It's not an exhibition. There's no exhibitions happening there. It really is more of a event space and a gathering, a social kind of community space, honestly, for artists, poets, and musicians to see each other, learn from each other, bump into each other, in what has become such a huge and atomized community in New York, to kind of create a little bit of a human scale version of how can that community have a place to gather. And then exhibition, display wise, that's a different exercise. The Artists Institute did that, dealt with the scale by kind of leaning into the problem. I always call it when you have a problem, the best thing to do is exaggerate the problem. So in that case, normal, the traditional criteria would tell me that having a tiny basement on Eldridge Street means that our problem is that we're just too small to matter. And so let's make the smallness of it the main thing. Let's make that as loud as possible. And so let's just put a single photograph by Rosemary Trockle in a room and call it a day. And because that's something that you can do. And if your room is that scale, and so make that the thing that is the characterizing in terms of display and exhibitions, rather than trying to do the apartment version of what potentially could be or should be done in a exhibition setting.
Right. And someone, Kara Cobb Johnson, says Trisha Van Eve in North Chicago does dinners. So, okay.
Yeah. No, there's a thriving, and there's a long history of this as well. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Anthony. Thanks to everyone for joining. We'll be back obviously next Wednesday. And Anthony, I'll see you in a minute with the students.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
All right, see you.
Bye.
Bye.